Good morning, Yidden. So today we're doing an introduction to Sadik Beis, Siman 92, Seif Gimel and Daled. Seif and Gimel and Daled is now the official first time we're being introduced to ChaNaN, even though we learned about ChaNaN because the principle came up in other scenarios. As you've said a number of times, the study of SEMICHA, to a large degree, is not so much about do's and don'ts, as it might be if you were learning the laws of Tefillah or even Shabbos, but it's largely learning the principles and then applying them to whatever scenario. So in every scenario, even if you're not learning the laws of ChaNaN, you still have to know if the laws of ChaNaN, if the principle of ChaNaN applies in that situation. Mm-hmm. So you end up learning about laws before you even learn about them, right? Because you're stacking principles. But officially, we're learning about the principle of ChaNaN now and here. So it's divided into two seifim, and the first seif, Gimel, introduces us to the law of ChaNaN and gives us a certain very important caveat. And then Daled gets to the next question about whether ChaNaN is limited to basar b'chalav, milk and meat, or whether it also applies to other Issurim, Tarovis at large, which came up in Kofei, which would make sense. Kofei is after Sadik Beis. And then we'll get to other caveats about ChaNaN as well. So let's get into it. So first, let's understand what ChaNaN means, or remind us what we learned about ChaNaN. Namely, literally it means chaticha nasin nevela. The piece itself becomes a nevela, becomes a non-kosher piece of meat, which means the item itself, prior to its absorption of whatever the item is in question, was a perfectly fine kosher piece. Let's imagine it's meat in our case, makes it easier. And now, considering what it has absorbed, it now itself becomes something that's not kosher. That's the literal translation. Now what that means is, because it itself became something not kosher, therefore, if it's going to be later nullified in a stew, then what we require is that the stew have 60 times the ratio of that piece of meat, and not just 60 times the amount of that which was absorbed, which is the cause for the prohibition here. Another way of putting this is, if that piece of meat itself already had 60 times that which was absorbed, you'd be perfectly fine. Because the meat itself is kosher, it absorbs something not kosher or whatever, milk, a piece of meat that absorbed milk, and it has 60 to the ratio. There's no flavor of that non-kosher / milk, the piece is fine. But considering it doesn't have that, and now it absorbed, so it itself becomes non-kosher, and we learned already in last sip that there's a time frame, right? It takes some time for that piece of meat to become ChaNaN, and now it later gets mixed into another pot. Now you need to have 60 times the ratio of the original thing. That's the essential idea. Now we're learning Seif Gimel was like this. Now, let's say you do have 60 times the ratio of the piece of meat. The piece of meat itself still remains a prohibited piece of meat, and you have to remove it, right? Well, remember, at the principle of bittul b'shishim, which we're going to learn in it's a kufav, right? Kufav is the principle of shishim, I think. The principle of shishim is only with regard to flavor, not with regard to a non-kosher piece itself. If you have a non-kosher piece of meat floating around and you can see it and you know it, you can't say, well, I have 60 times and start eating that non-kosher piece of meat. Certainly. It's only with regard to flavor, right? We learned already from the Mechaber that as far as he's concerned, if you have a guide to taste test for you, do that. Better than 60, because you know if you have the flavor or not. Because Tam K'ikr, the flavor is as if the item is there itself. So therefore, when you have ChaNaN, the piece of meat is in the stew. There's 60 times in the stew to the ratio of that piece of meat. So your stew is kosher, but the piece of meat is not and has to be thrown out. Okay. And now we get introduced to a new principle, which is a little bit, which puts a caveat on what we learned in the previous sifin. What if I cannot identify which piece of meat it is? So in the previous sifin, we learned that if you mix it all up and you can't identify what piece it is, you're okay, right? We learned today, we learn in Seif Gimel, that is only true if the piece of meat that's lost isn't a significant item. If it's significant enough, the sages tell us that the law of bittul doesn't apply. So let's just explain. Because biblically speaking, bittul is beroiv. So there's bittul of flavor. That's one thing, to nullify flavor. That's a universalism. Either you have a good taste test or 60 times the ratio that the sage is determined, flavor is gone. And when you have an item of non-kosher and it gets mixed in with other non-items, so long as it's a majority kosher, everything becomes kosher. That's the halacha, as far as the biblically speaking. That's bittul beroiv, right? And we're going to learn this with respect to dishes, for example. If a fork absorbed, or one of your forks absorbed non-kosher, and it's lost in your drawer, you can use all your forks. There's no problem. Bittul beroiv. That's the biblical halacha. Now the sages tell us that when it's a chaticha royal iskabed, that's the terminology, which literally translates as a piece that's worthy of honor. Royal iskabed is a piece worthy of honor. We're going to learn what that is. Which sifis that siman that come up. There's going to be a later siman, which is going to give us the exact definitions of what that means. Royal iskabed, where's it going to come up? It's going to come up in Kuf Aleph, I think. Yeah. In Kuf Aleph, we're going to learn the details of what this means, a piece that's worthy of honor, but it's a significant enough piece that you would treat it as a self-contained dish, let's just say. It's not like let's say you're making a stew, right? And you're making Chinese chicken. So it's like those little slivers of pepper steak. You would never serve that little piece of pepper steak on its own. It's too small, it's insignificant. That would be batul beroiv. That would be nullified in its majority. But if you're talking about pot roast, but instead of making one singular roast, you're making 5 minute steaks, then each minute steak would, in theory, be served and actually might be served as its own individual piece, even though it's in a stew. That's a chaticha royal iskabed. The piece itself is worthy of on its own of being a dish. In that case, the sages say we're not going to apply the biblical standard of bittul beroiv. And therefore, if the piece of meat that became ChaNaN is chaticha royal iskabed, it's something that's worthy of note. So if I know what it is, take it out. The rest of the stew is good. If I don't know which one it is, now all the pieces of meat are not kosher because I don't do bittul beroiv. So any piece of meat that is of the significant size royal iskabed would be forbidden, but the rest of the stew would be kosher because the rest of the stew is just a question of flavor. Whereas in the piece of meat, it's a doubt which one of the pieces of meat is the one that had the milk in it, that itself became ChaNaN. And because the sages forbade, or the sages limited the bittul beroiv when it comes to chaticha royal iskabed, then all the chatichas are royal iskabed, all the pieces of meat that are worthy of note in that stew would be not kosher. That's what we're going to learn in Sif Gimel.
But the rest of the stew would be okay.
Be kosher because the rest of the stew is a question of flavor. Right. So you have to divide between, is it a question of flavor, right, or is it a question of is this possibly chaticha royal iskabed? Is this possibly ChaNaN? So biblically speaking, even if it's ChaNaN, it's bittul beroiv. But if it's royal iskabed, it's not bittul beroiv. And therefore, all the royal iskabed in the stew will have to be removed if I don't know which one it is. If I know which one it is, I should remove that one. Okay, that's going to be Sif Gimel. That's pretty much the foundation of ChaNaN, and no dispute here. All agree, Mechaber Amah, it's a straightforward Sif. Now comes the next Sif, which becomes the question of does ChaNaN, apply only to basar b'chalav, or does it also apply to other prohibited absorptions? That's what's going to come up now. Now, we already touched on this a little bit in Kuf Hey, where we know already that the Ramah is of the view that ChaNaN does apply to other Issurim. We had that already, and even with respect to salting, as we learned already then. We learned already in Kuf Hey that the Ramah is of the view that ChaNaN does apply to other Issurim, a piece of meat that absorbed non-kosher fat. Will itself become ChaNaN, even if it absorbed through salting. We learned then in Kuf Hey, strict view, right? But that's going to be the machlekes here.
Originally, it's for basar b'chalav, and
so let's unpack that. Exactly right. So there's going to be another detail about Efsher l'soif that let's put that aside for a second. But the original case of ChaNaN in the Gemara is with respect to milk and meat, and that is certainly biblically. It's not just the rabbinic it's not just the rabbinic safeguard. It's biblically ChaNaN. Why is that? So we mentioned this a number of times, but now it's important to highlight it because we're going to contrast it with other Issurim and understand the machlekes. The Gemara's language is, and this we're going to unpack also a little bit today. The Gemara makes two statements. One is chaticha atzma nasa nevela, Okay, in colloquial terms, we dropped the word atzma, and we just stuck with chaticha nasa nevela, but the word atzma means itself. The chaticha atzma, the piece itself, nasa nevela becomes a nevela, but it's an awkward acronym if you did ChaNaN. So we dropped the ayin and made ChaNaN. That's why. I don't know if that's why it happened, but it did happen. So ChaNaN, chaticha nasa nevela. Okay, but the other expression of the Gemara is Efsher l'soichtoi, which means if I can extract the flavor or the absorption from the thing in which it's absorbed,
Like squeeze it out.
squeeze it out. Or I cooked it into a pot, and now the flavor, so a piece of meat absorbed something. Let's say it's all kosher in theory, yeah? Okay. No, actually, maybe not, because we don't want to make it machlekes in mitzvah, so make it machlekes in halacha, which is a self-discussion. Okay, so the piece of meat absorbed milk, right? And now I put it into a stew. Where's that milk now? Where's that milk? Only in the meat? It's in everything, right? So efshel l'soichtoi, I could extract the milk that it absorbed into everything. And yet I say efshel l'soichtoi aser. It's a machlekes in the Gemara, efshel l'soichtoi mutter aser, and we're going to rule that it's aser. We'll unpack that a bit more, why and how and when we say that, right? So if efshel l'soichtoi, if I can extract the flavor from the original piece, it still retains aser, therefore ChaNaN. The piece of meat remains aser. What's the rationale behind that? What's the rationale behind it? Why is it that efshel l'soichtoi is aser and therefore ChaNaN? What's the rationale? So the rationale originally primarily applies to milk and meat. Why is that? Because milk and meat are not kosher. They're inherently both completely fully kosher. What makes them aser? It's not in and of themselves. What makes them aser is their mixture. And biblically speaking, the mixture is in bishul cooking. So as soon as they're cooked together, it doesn't matter if I extract the milk from the meat. They were cooked together. Now the milk and the meat became not kosher. It's irrelevant as to whether or not the milk is in there or not. Even if I took the extremist view that literally all the milk was extracted from the meat, which is not the majority. There, some of the milk remains in there, even if most of the milk comes out. But let's just say, even if I say some of the milk stays in there, but the little bit of milk that's staying in there is nullified by 60 to the piece of meat, because the rest of the milk has come out into the rest of the stew. It doesn't matter if they went through the process of bishul together, which is the Isser deraisa, then they are both the milk and the meat also deraisa. Right. Another way of putting this is, it's not as if whilst they're together they're aser. Separate them, they're mutter. No, the act of cooking them together turns them into an Isser. So it's irrelevant if efshel l'soichtoi, the fact that I can extract the flavor from each other, they remain aser. Now try to apply that logic to meat that absorbed non-kosher fat. How do you apply that logic? The meat never became aser. At which point did the meat become aser? The meat only became aser because it retained the flavor of that which it absorbed, the non-kosher chalev. And if efshel l'soichtoi, if I'm capable of extracting the flavor out of that meat, why would the meat become aser? Why would the meat remain aser? Why would it remain aser? It never turned into an Isser. When it comes to milk and meat, the Torah says the moment milk is cooked with meat becomes aser and the milk becomes aser. Okay, so even if I took the milk out, the meat became aser because it went through the process of being cooked with milk. But the Torah never said that anything cooked with fat becomes aser. No, Torah just says don't eat fat. Don't eat the flavor of fat. Good, I extracted the flavor of fat. It is no longer aser. So the ChaNaN, following from efshel l'soichtoi, does not apply to other things that are not milk and meat. Right? So in theory, then, I have a piece of meat that absorbed fat. So now, is the piece of meat aser? No, it's not. It contains Isser, and therefore I can't eat it. And if efshel l'soichtoi, if I'm capable of extracting the Isser that it contains, then the meat should return to its state of kosher. How would I extract the flavor of that fat? By cooking it in a larger stew. So even if it retains a little bit of the original non-kosher fat, it's certainly nullified by 60 in that piece of meat. And the rest of the stew nullifies the rest of the fat. So everything is mutter. Now, if I follow this logic, sorry?
Supposedly.
Oh, that's right. And this is the machlekes. It's a machlekes to go back to the Rishonim between Rabbeinu Tam and Rabbeinu Ephraim. And the Machaber is going to rule, like Rabbeinu Ephraim, that Chaticha Nasan Nevela only applies to milk and meat, does not apply to any other prohibited stuff. And therefore, if meat absorbed non-kosher fat, and there's not 60 to the ratio, I cannot eat that meat. But then later that piece of meat falls into a greater stew, and in the stew there's 60 to the ratio of the original fat, mutter. Whereas the Ramah is going to rule, no, the Chaticha Nasan Nevela does apply to other Issurim as well. The question is why? The logic I just told you seems to be very sound logic, that if you can extract the prohibited item, there's no reason that the original thing that had it should remain awesome. Let's think of it this way. Your pot absorbs non-kosher food. What do? You do Hagala, right? You boil it up. What's the process of Hagala? It's to extract the flavor. And now I'm going to tell you, no, Chaticha Nasan Nevela, the Keli is no aser. The problem is this absorption. The absorption's out. It's good goodbye, Charlie. It's done. So the same thing with the piece of meat. Extract.
But you can argue it's different because the piece of meat, like the kili, is actually you're going to actually take away. There's always going to be
No.
There's always going to be some. It's just still left. It's not going to like.
In where?
In the piece of meat.
So that's the machlekes here.
Yeah.
So there are Maz of the view that Chaticha Nasan Nevela remains true even for other Yisurim. Why? Either one reason is because you just said, when it comes to as opposed to a pot where you could extract all the flavor that's in that pot, with a piece of meat you can never do full Hagala. Let's say you took the piece of meat and you boiled it in water. You're not going to extract all the fat that's at that meat. Some's going to remain. And therefore, even if it's not ChaNaN biblically, because biblically speaking, you nullified the flavor is not going to be recognizable in that meat, but rabbinically it's going to be there. Reason A, to say that the ChaNaN applies even to other Issurim, was that clear? Yeah. Reason B is to make it uniform with Basar B'chalav. Now, there actually is a view, I think it's a Akiva Eger, yeah, who's of the view, for the rationale you just said, that Chaticha Nasan Nevela is even biblical for other Issurim, because you never fully extract the other flavor. So he's of the view that's even biblical, but I don't think that's a majority view. The majority view is that Chaticha Nasan Nevela in other Issurim, according to Rabbeinu Tam / Ramah, is only rabbinic. But when it comes to Basar B'chalav, it's deraisa. And the fact that it's rabbinic is going to be relevant. We'll get to that in a moment. Okay, so now we have the machlekes clear. Basar B'chalav rationally, Chaticha Nasan Nevela, which is built on Efsher l'soichdoi aser, is rationally applies only to Basar B'chalav, because it's only in Basar B'chalav where their union creates the Isser, and therefore the fact that they're separated doesn't change the fact that they went through that union and therefore they remain aser. Whereas when it comes to other Issurim, it's not their union that makes it aser. It's only one item that's aser. And if you extract that other item, there's no reason for the original thing to remain aser.
It's not Isser Machmas Atzmai.
It's exactly. When by Basar B'chalav, it's Isser Machmas Atzmai, because in their union they become aser. Extract them, they still remain aser. Whereas when it comes to other Issurim, fat or blood or whatever, it's only the fact that I contain the Isser that makes me aser. And as soon as I no longer contain the Isser, there's no reason for me to be aser.
So it's ChaNaN only as a borrowed concept.
It's ChaNaN as a borrowed concept. Drabanan. The Ramah is going to say Drabanan, it applies to, with the exception of a Akiva Eger, but the Ramah is going to say it's Drabanan. We're borrowing because you can't fully extract it, because we don't want to separate between, we don't want to differentiate between Basar B'chalav and other things. But we're applying ChaNaN to other Yisurim, only the Rabbanan. Okay, so now let's go back to the Machaber's view. Based on what we just said now, a piece of meat absorbs a little bit of fat. It falls into a stew. A piece of meat falls into fat falls into a piece of meat. The meat absorbs. The meat is now aser because it has non-kosher fat in it, and it doesn't have enough, a 60 to the ratio. That piece of meat now falls into a stew. The whole thing's mixed together. Can I eat that original piece of meat or not? What do you think, based on what we just said?
Probably, yeah.
L'chora,
Maybe.
you should be able to eat the original piece of meat, right? Because if it's capable of being extracted, right? It's capable of the flavor that's in there is capable to be extracted. So there's nothing that makes the original piece of meat more worthy of being usher than anything else in the stew. The flavor is now equally distributed between the entire stew, not in that piece of meat in any way, especially more. And seemingly, that piece of meat should be mutter. And that's indeed what the Machaber writes over here. Remains mutter. Because if it's capable of extracting the flavor from the original piece of meat, then there's nothing that makes that meat more a conduit for the forbidden fat than anything else in the stew. And if everything else in the stew is nullifying it, then why should that meat also be part of the nullification?
Okay, but I guess in this case we would be.
And that's going to be different than the basar v'challah.
For sure.
Yeah.
But we're going even further. When I say no ChaNaN by other Issurim, I'm even saying Efsher mutter. That because I can extract the flavor from the original piece of meat that absorbed that non-kosher fat, so now that non-kosher meat, that meat that originally had the fat, doesn't contain enough of the non-kosher fat to be usher. The same way the rest of the stew doesn't contain enough to make it usher.
But still, the stew needed 60 times.
The stew needed 60 times.
60 times the piece, not 60
No,
times.
60 times only the flavor.
60 times only the fat.
Only the fat, because not chaticha nasan avela.
Uh-huh.
The piece of meat is not usher. It only contains isser. And now that the isser contained is extracted, it now shares the absorption with the rest of the stew, so that the entire stew has 60 to the ratio. Everything's mutter, including the original piece.
Mm-hmm.
Because Efsher l'soich mutter and no ChaNaN. When by basar b'cholav, Efsher l'soich aser. By basar b'cholav, even if I can extract the milk and the meat remain aser because they went through the process of union. But when it comes to non-kosher fats, it's not Efsher l'soich aser. If I can extract the flavor from the original piece of meat, mutter.
So
And therefore the rest of the stew shares together to nullify.
So to begin with, that piece of meat that absorbed some non-kosher fat is usher.
Only
Now
because it
adding-
contains.
Now, pardon me?
Not because it itself is usher.
Not because
Only because it contains
it
isser.
contains fat, but the whole piece is usher.
Yes, because it contains fat.
Because it contains fat. Now put it into a stew.
It no longer contains enough fat to make it usher.
And now only it's going to be measured against the fat that it absorbs,
Correct.
and not the piece.
Because the piece of meat no longer contains enough fat to make it usher, because Efsher l'soich, it's capable of extracting. So it no longer contains in itself enough to make itself usher. So chayseres leis mutter, everything becomes mutter. That's how the moral rules here. However, the Ramah contradicts. That's how the Shulchan Aruch rules here, but the Shulchan Aruch contradicts itself.
Yeah.
Elsewhere, as the Taz points out in Siman Kovav, which we haven't learned yet, I think the Shach also points it out. The Taz definitely points it out that elsewhere the Machaber contradicts itself. And elsewhere in Kovav, the Machaber writes that if a piece of meat absorbed fat, and then the piece of meat, not kosher fat, and it's not enough 60 to the ratio, so you cannot eat that piece of meat, and then that piece of meat was put into a stew, he says, as long as the stew has 60 to the ratio of the fat, the stew is kosher, but the piece of meat remains also.
Yeah.
Not like he says here. What's the rationale? Because he separates between Efsher l'soich and ChaNaN.
Yeah.
So we don't say ChaNaN, and therefore we don't have 60 to the ratio of the original piece of meat, but Efsher l'soich remains also. Even if I can extract the flavor from the meat, because it did have meat, it remains also. So we're separating between Efsher l'soich and ChaNaN in Kovav. Here we're linking it, but there he separates it. And the Taz rules that the Iker is like in Kovav. And how to reconcile the contradictions, many different Mefarshim that do that, and it might come up in some of your summaries, but I don't think it's a major sugya worthy of going down to just to reconcile the contradiction, because the halacha remains.
So
that
the Maisa, the pieces can't be.
the mice of the piece is awesome. That's right.
The piece is awesome.
But, well, first of all, we pass on the Ramah, we anyway say ChaNaN, that you need 60 to the ratio of the original piece of meat.
Not just to the fat.
Not just to the fat, but to the original piece of meat. But for the Machaber, you might be able to combine this heter with some other. Let's say you don't know what piece of meat it is.
Right.
So maybe you could be more lenient. Because anyway, there's a view which says Efsher l'soich mutter when it comes to other prohibitions, not milk and meat. Is it clear? Yeah, Aaron with me? Yeah, Mendel? Clear, yeah? Good. Okay.
So the Maisa in our case, actually all of this doesn't hold because we're going to hold that the entire piece was ChaNaN.
Yes, but it's still important to know that there is a view which says ChaNaN is mutter, because the Ramah, as we'll see in a moment, the Ramah is going to use it as a tzad laheter. We're going to see that, we've already had this before, but we're going to see it again, that a lot of times, especially for Ramah's chumrah stuff, the Ramah is going to say we should be machmer. Let's say in two principles, the Ramah is going to say to be machmer. And then when those two principles come together, he's going to say, okay, I'm not going to give you double chumrah. Now be lenient. Especially if there's going to be monetary loss. Because I have two reasons to be makel. I'll give an example, which is going to come up in this. Let's say you have, okay, so everything we talked about till now is where the piece of meat absorbed fat while it's outside of the pot, and then it went into the pot. So we're going to say ChaNaN, according to the Ramah. And you need to have 60 to the ratio of the piece of meat, yeah? Let's say it fell into, taken from last week's example, it fell onto a piece of meat that's partially protruding outside. Now we learned last week that there's a machlekes. That piece of meat, which is half in the stew, half out of the stew, there's a dispute. Some say it's considered part of the stew and it never becomes ChaNaN. Others say it's like it's out of the stew and it does become ChaNaN. And we, Ramah, ruled we're going to treat it like ChaNaN. But now, let's say it absorbed non-kosher fat. So I'm taking two chumras of ChaNaN. I'm taking the chumrah of ChaNaN that there's such a thing as ChaNaN by other Issurim, by non-kosher fats. B, I'm taking ChaNaN where it's half popping out. So they say, be lenient, especially if there's going to be a lot of amount of monetary loss. Because I'm not going to make you be machmer on 2 grounds, especially if it's going to cost you the SEMICHA where you made a stew for the whole bar mitzvah. No one's going to have a stew for the bar mitzvah, right? So okay, we'll make it more lenient. And this is a principle that will come up quite a bit throughout Tarovis Basar B'chalav. And when you have 2 chumras, or another way of putting that is, you have 2 reasons to be mekel, because there's double opinion to say it's mekel. First of all, there's an opinion which says that there's no such thing as ChaNaN when it's not milk and meat. Right. A. B, there are those who say that this piece, which is half popping out, is considered part of the stew to begin with. So therefore, okay, be mekel, especially when there's a monetary loss, right? This is going to come up quite a bit. Okay. Now there's another important thing in the Ramah. Okay, that was that. There's okay, 3 more important things in the Ramah. Okay, number 1. The whole, because of what I just told you, the ChaNaN application by other Issurim, by other things that are not possible b'chalav, is only going to be where I'm absolutely certain that this thing became ChaNaN, as opposed to where it's half popping in, half popping out, where there's a doubt whether it's even ChaNaN to begin with, because maybe it's part of the whole stew, right? So it has to be outside the pot first, absorb, become ChaNaN, and then mixed in, and then I'm going to apply the chumrah that I'm applying ChaNaN even to other Issurim. Yeah? Okay. There's another example of ChaNaN being applied to other Issurim, even when, to begin with, the whole thing was cooked together, where it didn't become ChaNaN outside. Namely, what the Ramah calls Isser Davuk. Isser Davuk means where the piece of meat itself is attached to the Isser. So say, for example, a piece of meat that has the Gidam Nasha in it. It still has that the sciatic nerve in it. Now, when did it become ChaNaN?
Because it has the part attached.
Right, but till I cook it, it's not ChaNaN. We learned already before. You can cut it out and just eat your meat, right? But now, if I cooked I didn't do that, and I cooked that piece of meat that has a sciatic nerve in it into the stew. So even though it's being cooked in an entire thing, because the prohibition is davuk, because the prohibition is attached to the meat, that meat will become ChaNaN even in the stew. Because in order for that sciatic nerve flavor to make it to the rest of the stew, it must first go through the piece of meat that it's attached to. And because of that, in that process, that piece of meat becomes ChaNaN. That's one way of explaining it. I think it's a more simple way of explaining it. There is another view how to explain it differently, but the bottom line is that Ramah definitely says that Isser Davuk, when the piece of meat is attached to the prohibited item, even if it's cooked together with the whole stew, it becomes ChaNaN because it's attached to the prohibited item. And the simplest way to explain it is because even as that Isser goes to the rest of the stew, it's only going to go to the rest of the stew by first being absorbed in the piece of meat. And in that time period, When the piece of meat is absorbing the prohibition before it makes it to the rest of the stew, the piece of meat becomes ChaNaN.
We're also, I guess, assuming the kind of, fatty piece of meat where it's gonna.
Fatty, yes. Okay, yeah.
No, I mean, just for us to remember, it's just,
Yeah.
I mean, the reminder we did.
And Ramad doesn't differentiate,
But
but yeah.
we're assuming that there is like, it's still somewhat fatty, like.
Somewhat, yes.
We always like theoretically like.
Okay, Yavish, we're going to get to also.
Yeah.
I wasn't talking about that. Yes.
Okay.
Good point.
Okay.
Was that clear? The logic clear on this?
Yeah.
You want to make it easier. If you want to do that, instead of calling it Gidanasha, say it's piece of meat that's attached to non-kosher fat. You didn't remove the non-kosher fat. So it's still attached to it. So in order for that non-kosher fat to make its way to the rest of the stew, it's going to have to be absorbed in the meat first. And during that time, it becomes ChaNaN.
Is it also because it's intrinsically also?
The meat isn't intrinsically also.
No, the Gidanash. Isn't it the
Fine, so just extract the Gidanash and eat the rest of the stew because the flavor is nullified by 60, right? That's what the Machaber would say.
Why is it ChaNaN though, if it's not the Basar B'chalav?
So again, there are most of the view that the ChaNaN applies even to not Basar B'chalav. But on two conditions, either A, it became ChaNaN outside the pot, or B, it becomes ChaNaN because it's dovuk, it's attached to the asa, even if it got cooked in the stew.
Mm-hmm.
And the logic that we're presenting, there's other logic, but this is the one we're presenting here, is that because in order for that non-kosher to make its way to the stew, it has to first be absorbed in that meat that's attached to, and then it becomes ChaNaN. So there's a time period in which the meat becomes ChaNaN before the rest of the stew gets activated to nullify the original flavor. And therefore it becomes ChaNaN in Rama. It's a chumrah.
Can you remind me
Clear?
what we said about it becoming, ushered before it goes in the pot?
We learned last week, right, that if let's say milk fell onto a piece of meat that's in your pot, but not in your stew, like the stew only goes halfway up and there's a piece of meat above, and instantaneously you cover the pot or you mix the whole thing together. So at no point did that piece of meat spend enough time turning into ChaNaN. Then 60 to the ratio of the milk and you're good to go, right? Which means there's a time period at which the meat has to become ChaNaN, even by milk and meat, certainly by absorbing non-kosher fats. So the Ramah's chumrah of applying ChaNaN to non-kosher fats or non-kosher Issurim will have to be either it did that absorption before it went into the pot, or the chumrah if it's attached to the non-kosher. Dovuk is the language. Isur dovuk. Clear?
Yes.
Somewhat. Were we short?
We captured that.
Right. Okay. So let's imagine it this way. You need a time period for the piece to become ChaNaN. Right. So either it's outside, it absorbed, became ChaNaN. Now it got mixed into the pot. Okay. Right. The other thing is to visualize it, make it easier. You put a piece of meat. You have a piece of this is your non-kosher fat, and you have, and this is one piece of meat. Right. These cups are one piece of meat, and this is your fat. Yeah.
They're not kosher.
Non-kosher fat inside my meat. Yeah.
Right.
And put the whole thing into a pot.
Right.
Right. Now, in order for this fat to mix with the entire stew, in order to be nullified to the 60 ratio, it takes time. During that time, it's traveling through this piece of meat, and during that time, it becomes ChaNaN. This meat becomes ChaNaN. So by the time the fat makes it out, this meat's already ChaNaN, and you have 60 to the ratio of meat, not just to the ratio of the fat. That's Isur dovuk. Using this logic. There's other logic using this logic. Sorry?
That would only be according to the Ramah.
Only according to the Ramah, for sure. This is according to one interpretation of the Ramah. There's another one. I'm not sure which one they'll pick over there, but this is the more sound one, I think.
It's a stringency. We're taking a stringency to prevent, people.
But there's rationale to it. The rationale is the meat becomes non-kosher on its own before the rest of the pot absorbs the flavor of the non-kosher.
As if it were outside.
As if it were outside. And therefore it becomes ChaNaN. So therefore, when it gets to the rest of the pot, you have to 60 the ratio of the whole meat. Yeah. Okay. That's the rationale of dovuk. The other rationale is that there might have been a time when that piece of meat was outside the stew. And in that time, it absorbed. That's another rationale. Okay. Two more items. Yeah, two more items. Number one is the question of lach balach.
They're both wet.
If they're both wet, do we say ChaNaN? So it's a machlekes to begin with. If by milk and meat you say ChaNaN, let's say a little bit of milk falls into a mixture of tallow, meat tallow. All right, so all liquidy. Do I say ChaNaN there? Even milk and meat. How much more so? It's going to be a question whether I apply that to to other sort of non-kosher fat into non-kosher fat into kosher tallow. Yeah. So that's also going to come up in the Mechaber. Yeah. And the rationale to be lenient, okay, we'll get to that. We'll get to that as well. Yeah. Okay, we're going to see, because there's going to be a shach here, which I think will come up in your summaries, who will write that liquid by milk and meat is not astringency. It's actually biblically ChaNaN.
Like cooking, you can cook liquid.
You can cook liquid. So a little bit of milk into tallow would be ChaNaN d'oraisa according to the shach, which raises us up a notch in our chumrah when we're applying it to other Issurim as well. Okay. What's also going to come up is the question of ChaNaN by Kalim. And you're going to see that Ramah is going to tell us to see Tzadik Ches. So we're going to leave it for Tzadik Ches. So that's going to be a bigger discussion, Tzadik Ches, the nature of ChaNaN by Kalim. So we already learned, I mentioned this earlier, that if your pot absorbs non-kosher, you kosherize it and it all comes out, right? So the pot itself certainly doesn't become ChaNaN. But what happens if the pot itself absorbed, let's say, kosher food, and then it absorbed non-kosher food? Does the kosher food that's inside the pot become ChaNaN because it now absorbed non-kosher food? That's going to become a discussion, mentioned a little bit here, but more inside the Ches. Okay. Okay, and then finally, the last case is going to be Yavesh b'Yavesh. So the Ramah doesn't explain himself what he means. Let's just explain the scenario. You have 2 pieces of steak, kosher. One of them absorbed non-kosher fat. Yeah, not 60 to the ratio. So that piece of meat would definitely be non-kosher. Now, both of those pieces of meat fell into a stew. And in the stew, there's 60 to the ratio of the fat. What's with those 2 pieces of meat? Can I eat the stew? For sure I can eat because it has 60 to the ratio of the fat.
Mhm.
But what about the pieces of meat itself?
So they're touching when it goes in the stew? Is that what you said?
Doesn't really matter.
So it's
It doesn't matter?
I don't know. Maybe it matters because the fat has to travel into the other piece of meat.
Well, one
otherwise-
of the pieces already became
Oh, you don't
ChaNaN.
know which one.
You don't know which one it is.
Oh, you don't know.
One of the pieces of meat is ChaNaN. Rabbinically, Ramah Chumrah, one of the pieces of meat is ChaNaN. Now, so you have a ChaNaN piece of meat and you have a kosher piece of meat. You don't know which one's which, and they both fall into a stew. So the stew is
Okay.
definitely kosher because it has 60 to the ratio of that non-kosher fat. But can I eat the pieces of meat?
Are they like special meats, whatever you?
They're royal iskabet. Yes, they're appropriate for being worthy. Yes.
So assuming
So
no,
they're what?
I would assume they're not allowed because of the rule we said earlier.
Because
Like if you don't know which one with royal miskabed, then you
but-
can't.
does that? But what happens? That the fact when you don't know which one, when it's royal iskabet and you're machmir, that's not intrinsic ledin. It's only astringency. The
Mhm.
fact that I'm applying ChaNaN to non-kosher fats is also astringency. Double stringency, heter.
Again,
The fact that I say between pieces of meat that I don't know and there's a roiv, I say they're all not kosher is itself astringency.
Mhm.
The fact that I say ChaNaN by non-kosher fats is also astringency. Double stringency
yeah.
equals heter.
Mhm.
2 positives make a negative, right? So 2 or 2
Right.
negatives make a positive. 2 chumris gives you a heter.
So is it straight or is it?
It's not mamshes veka. It's 2 stade heter. Yeah.
To what?
Stade, 2 sides, two considerations to be lenient. Like sad in the plural is stade.
So when we said
Yeah.
earlier, the royal
Yes, I think that covers
miskabed,
everything. Sorry?
It was about basar halav.
Yes, the royal iskabed was basar b'chalav. That's correct. The royal iskabed was basar b'chalav. All right.
Oh, is that the baby? It sounds like the
Yeah.
baby.
Okay, which means if this is correct, what I just told you, then that means what if it's only 2 pieces of meat that fall in? Do I have bittul b'roiv?
Depends.
I don't.
Banana.
Well, I'm applying 2 heterim here. One heter is that when I don't know which piece of meat it is, I'm stringent to say all are non-kosher, but really they should be kosher because it's bottle. But only if it's b'roiv, which means you have to have
3.
3. So therefore the Taz says, Taka, or the Shach, I'm sorry, that in that stew you have to have a third piece of meat so that you can apply the double heter. Even though the Ramah is not explicit on that, but that's the way the Shach rules, considering the logic I just told you.
The Mechaber might be different because you might say not say it's ChaNaN, so then you might.
The Ramah will say the whole thing's not ChaNaN to begin with.
Yeah.
There is no ChaNaN by other Issurim in the Mechaber. So in the Mechaber, even if you have one piece of meat, you know which one it is. And you know it absorbs non-kosher fat. It goes into a stew. Stew has 60 to the ratio. Everything is mutter. According to this siman, even the piece of meat, original piece of meat was aser. According to other siman, the original piece of meat is aser. Right? But certainly in this siman, everything will become mutter. Okay, we clear? All right, so Be'ez Hashem will learn inside all these principles. Hashem's help on Wednesday,
Okay.
we'll learn Chazar Elamaisa. Any thoughts, comments, questions? Anything unclear? Okay, good luck, everybody. Good week.
Oh yeah.
Let's look at Limud.
Go ahead.